Hey, everybody at the factory, the warehouse, the fire hall, and those of you at home or wherever you are, welcome to our teaching time. You know, not all lost treasures are actually lost. Sometimes they're stolen. It was 3 a.m. on the morning of December the 15th, 1916, in the then capital of Romania, a city called Iași. It's hard to be quiet when you're readying a steam engine and loading 21 boxcars, but the Romanian soldiers were doing their very best to not attract attention. Days earlier, the Romanian authorities had come to grips with the likelihood that their country would fall to the Germans in what we now refer to as World War I. Romania had joined the Allied forces of England, France, and Russia, but fighting on two fronts was making them vulnerable to defeat. So, the decision was made to load the Romanian gold reserves, 120 tons of gold bars and coins, onto 21 boxcars, sneaking them to Russia for safekeeping. A deal had been brokered with Romania's neighbor that Russia would guard Romania's gold until it was safe to return to the National Bank of Romania. However, 7 months later, the situation in Romania was only getting worse, so a second train was loaded, this time with the most precious objects of the Romanian state, including the royal archives, 3,500-year-old golden jewels, the gold jewels of the Romanian royalty, thousands of paintings, religious artifacts, and manuscripts, along with other priceless treasures. Again, under the cloak of darkness, the treasure train snaked its way to the Kremlin for safekeeping. In today's dollars, the Russians were now guarding over $5 billion of gold, as well as more than $5 billion of national treasures. So you can imagine how excited and anxious the Romanians were to arrange the repatriation of their treasures once the war ended. However, there was a problem. The Russians refused to give them back. And every Romanian president and government since 1918 has attempted to negotiate a return of their treasure, but with no success. In fact, earlier this year, the Romanians made yet another attempt to have their $10 billion of national treasures returned. But once again, talks are stalled. Sometimes, lost treasures are lost because they've actually been stolen. It's not unlike what has happened to many of the rich and priceless teachings of the ancient scriptures. Some have been misplaced and lost over time, but others have been pilfered. And when I think of the lost treasure that we're going to locate today, I tend to think that it was stolen. Welcome to week 2 of a new series we're calling Lost Treasure. Last weekend, we dug deep and unearthed a most forgotten treasure that has vanished from our faith, the treasure of God's wrath. Now, if you weren't here for that teaching, there's no way I can reteach it. But let me just say, as we dusted it off, we discovered God's wrath is not what people think it is. In fact, we came to see God's wrath as something shockingly important, indispensable, and a true treasure to behold. If you missed that teaching, I would encourage you to go on a search of your own to find it, because it may be the only sermon you hear on God's wrath in your lifetime. Then we did something this past week that we've never done before. We dug up a second treasure, another word from the book of Romans, the word justification, and created a 20-minute midweek YouTube study intended to guide our life groups through an evening of interaction and learning together. Each week through this series, we're going to excavate one word from the book of Romans on the weekend, and then Pastor Dunson, our life group's pastor, and another one of our pastors will quarry out another word during the week for our life groups. Those studies can be found on our life groups page under resources. So we've exhumed God's wrath in the word justification so far, and today we're adding to our collection of rare and treasured but often lost words a third word. Now, out of all the New Testament books, Paul in the book of Romans uses this word the most, depending on the translation, anywhere from 60 to 100 times. In fact, the first 6 chapters of the book of Romans that we read this past week in our chapter a day reading challenge is the most penetrating and extensive treatment of this word in the entire Bible. And yet you barely hear it spoken or referenced anymore. Now, similar to the warning I gave you last weekend, when I tell you what the word is, you're probably going to recoil a bit and think, that's not a treasure. And I didn't misplace it. I threw it out. Or perhaps you'll be thinking, we're better off without that word and that concept, so why dig it up? And similar to our exploration of God's wrath last weekend, I'm going to ask that you hang in there and let's see what we can actually learn together. Now, it would take too long for us to read Romans chapter 1 to 6 out loud right now, so let me hopscotch through these chapters as we lay a foundation for our study. Here we go. What shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all, for all are under the power of sin. For everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. When Adam sinned, sin entered the world. Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. But God demonstrated his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. For God presented Jesus as a sacrifice for sin. People are made right with God when they believe that Jesus sacrificed his life, shedding his blood. So you also should consider yourself to be dead to the power of sin and alive to God through Christ Jesus. And there it is, a lost treasure that has not only been lost, but stolen. The word sin. You know, the world-renowned American psychiatrist Carl Menninger, founder of the famed Menninger Clinic in Kansas, wrote a book in 1931. It was entitled From Sin to Psychiatry, an interview on the way to mental health. He was completely convinced that much of our mental health, addictions, and unhealthy cravings, thoughts, and actions could be explained by the brokenness and the emotional pain caused by sin. Maybe even more remarkable was that this respected psychiatrist was able to publish a scholarly book with the word sin in the title and still be held in high esteem. Well, 42 years later, nearing the end of his life, Dr. Menninger wrote another book, this one called Whatever Became of Sin. In it, Menninger discerned that the word sin had all but vanished from the 1973 culture. And he asked the big question, why? Why has sin disappeared? He pressed the question and asked, have we reached the point where we no longer sin? Or is it that we no longer consider anything to be wrong? Menninger, a medical professional, not a theologian, warned that should the concept of sin become eliminated from our open cultural discourse, any hope of a moral society would indeed vanish and chaos would ensue, logically, inevitably, and certainly. Church, the world Menninger could only imagine but was predicting is the world in which we now live. Somebody has stolen from our culture the idea and concept, the understanding and the warnings about sin in an attempt to hide the one road that leads out of the valley of death. But today, we want to locate and steal back this word. But before we'll ever be motivated to do so, we need to understand the value of this word and why we call it a priceless treasure. So let's begin jotting down some observations about this lost treasure called sin. Number one, it all started with a lie. In Romans 5:2, the Apostle Paul says, when Adam sinned, sin entered the world. Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. Paul is referring all the way back to the first two chapters of the Bible and to the beginning of time when God created everything. God stood back and said, whoa, I really outdid myself because this is spectacular. It is so great. Then before Eve was formed, God turned to the first human ever created, and we read, the Lord warned him, you may freely eat the fruit of every tree in the garden, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat its fruit, you are sure to die. You know, when I was a youth pastor nearly 30 years ago, we had a couple of old school buses, and we would routinely run trips to Minneapolis that we called Cheap Trek. The idea was to get as many students to join us for this great weekend of fun and friendship building and adventure. And just before closing the doors on the old bus and jumping into the driver's seat, I'd stand up and yell to the students, okay, I'm really looking forward to traveling with you guys, but you need to know that I only have one rule to obey. We're gonna have a fantastic trip, but if you break it, you could risk being sent home. Okay, are you ready to go? Inevitably, a student would yell, hold it, what's the rule? And I'd say, okay, some of you must not have heard me. I only have one rule to obey, and we're gonna have a fantastic trip. Break it, and you could risk being sent home. Okay, let's go have some fun. And I never did tell them what the rule was. Students would come to me throughout the trip and try to guess the rule, naming 15 to 20 different rules. And I'd always encourage them and say, yup, that just might be the rule, but I never actually told them the rule. So why did I never tell them the rule? Because it wasn't about the rule. I wanted them to be thinking. I wanted them to be assessing their own behavior. I didn't want them obsessing over 1, 2, or 3 rules and then finding creative ways to skirt around them. I wanted them to act responsibly and own the trip and create their own responsible guidelines. And in the same way, I find it interesting that God never tells Adam and Eve why they can't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He doesn't say, well, it's full of carbs and sugars, it's not good for you. Or it's poisonous and it'll kill you. Or by eating it, you'll damn the entire human race and its billions and billions of people into pain, misery, brokenness, and estrangement from me. No, God is saying, I'm not going to tell you why. Because if you were to obey me because you could see that it would be good for you, that's not really obeying me. That's following the rules for your own good. But I want you to obey me just because you love me and you respect me and you trust me. Then in Genesis chapter 3, Satan shows up and says, did God really say that you must not eat fruit from any of the trees in the garden? You won't die. God knows that your eyes will be open as soon as you eat it, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. At this point, sin hadn't entered the human bloodstream yet. The gooey black sludge of sin hadn't slowed the human heart yet. But to get there, Satan needed to be tricky. So what does he do? He doesn't question whether there really is a God or not. No, he begins to target Adam and Eve's trust of God, and he executes a subtle character assassination of God. You can't trust God. He's hiding something from you. He's trying to hold you down. God is weak and threatened that you might one day discover the truth and become as powerful as he is. God doesn't love you, and if you obey him and his one command, you'll never be happy. The Scottish theologian and preacher Sinclair Ferguson tells a story of a father who takes his young son to a huge New York toy store at Christmas time. They open the door, and the old school bell that hung above the door announced their entry. Instantly, the air was filled with buzzes and dings and dongs and hums of a store full of action toys. The father seemed just as excited as the son, and pointing to the largest Lego set either of them had ever seen, he asked his son, "Would you like that?" The little boy could only gasp, "Really?" But before he could take a step closer, the father's eye caught a wall full of robots. "Or maybe you'd like one of those." "No way," cried the son. For half an hour, the father and son wandered the store, and the boy in a state of dazed wonder. Finally, they had settled into this massive video game section with the latest and fastest games ever made. Just then, the father grabbed the son by the arm, started heading for the door, and said, "Well, now that you've seen all that this amazing store has to offer at Christmas time, I want you to know you're not getting any of it. Let's go." Sinclair Ferguson goes on to explain that that is exactly what Satan tells people. He's saying God is like the father in the toy store. He isn't good, and he doesn't want good for you. So Adam and Eve begin feasting on the lie that started the avalanche of sin that has cascaded from generation to generation to generation to generation, infecting every human being. But you need to know, it all started with a lie. Here's observation number 2. Sin causes self-sovereignty to live in all of us. The Old Testament book of Hosea, chapter 10, verse 13 says this, "You plow wicked ways, reaped a crop of evil, and ate a salad of lies. You thought you could do it all on your own." When people think of sin, inevitably a grocery list of do-nots appears in their mind. Do not swear. Do not cheat on your spouse. Do not lie. Do not lustfully objectify people by using pornography. Do not boast. Do not get drunk. Do not judge. Do not act proudly. And do not murder or hurt people. And that's great for a kindergarten Sunday school class. But as we grow up, we need to realize that sin is not simply about a moral slip-up or a rule accidentally broken. Sin is eating the salad of Satan's lie and having a heart of self-sovereignty. You plow wicked ways, reaped a crop of evil, and ate a salad of lies. You thought you could do it all on your own. Sin isn't a grocery list of don'ts. It's a mistrustful state that moves us out of communion with God into a state of alienation and rebellion. It's what lies inside our hearts. It's our very nature. One lazy sunny afternoon, a turtle was happily swimming along a lakeshore. That's when he heard a voice. It was a small but commanding voice saying, "Hey, give me a ride across the lake." When the turtle finally located the source of the voice, he stopped swimming and yelled back, "Why would I ever give you a ride across the lake? You're a scorpion, and you'll probably sting me." The scorpion just laughed. "My dear turtle friend, if I were to sting you, you would drown, and I would go down with you and drown as well. Now where is the logic in that?" The turtle slowly pondered it in his mind and finally said, "You're right, hop on." So the scorpion climbed aboard, and the turtle paddled his big fins in the water. Halfway across the lake, the scorpion rose up and gave the turtle a big sting, and the turtle began to drown. As they both sank into the water, the turtle turned to the scorpion and with a tear in his eye said, "My friend, why did you sting me? Now we're both going to drown." Gasping for air, he tried to continue, "Where is the logic in that?" "It has nothing to do with logic," the scorpion sadly replied. "It's just my nature." Sin isn't a grocery list of don'ts that are subject to cultural norms. Sin is a lie that always questions God's goodness and convinces us that our sovereignty and superiority is what's most important, and that is just in our nature. Sin is a mistrustful state that moves us out of communion with God into a state of alienation and rebellion. Okay, that's a lot to absorb. So let's take a little bit of a break to worship and mobilize, and then we're going to come back together to discover the true value of this word and why we call it a lost or stolen treasure. So we actually have two big initiatives that we're rolling out this weekend. Carolyn rolled out the first one we're calling Eswatini Not Forgotten. This is going to be a great opportunity for us to not only reconnect with our friends and partners in Eswatini, but to be a blessing and encouragement to so many who could really use some encouragement and love. The second action-filled initiative we're calling Operation Flying Carpet. 22 years ago, a team of 30 people were told that they could have all the carpet tile that they could rip out of the 19th and 20th floors of the Richardson building. So they stripped the place of 20,000 square feet of carpet tile, flew it out of the building, and it landed in the factory. Well, 22 years later, it's time for that carpet tile to fly again as we get rid of that secondhand tile and install some new carpet. So we're looking for a team of 40 people to rip out the old carpet on Friday, November the 25th from 6:30 to 9:30. Then we're looking for a team of 30 people to install the new carpet on Saturday, November 26th, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., just in time for the evening service. Additionally, we're also looking for coffee break and lunch providers and servers to keep our work crews fueled up. If you'd like to sign up to serve, you can do so on the paper form in our live services or online from the Riverwood app or website. Well, I'm pretty sure the Romanians would love to have their $10 billion worth of national treasure that was stolen back in their possession. But I'm not so sure that we're as anxious to get the stolen treasure of this biblical word sin back, and I totally get it. Most times what comes with the word sin is condemnation, guilt, shame, conviction, judgment, and punishment. So aren't we really better off without the word? But avoiding a word doesn't make life any better. It actually makes it worse. Years ago, I was literally terrified of the D word. I would never complain to anybody loudly about my aching molar or a sensitive tooth because I was frightened of the D word. Well, one day I was in our life group. I was just with the guys and we were getting a bit vulnerable. And I told them that I had this wickedly sore tooth and that I was suffering from it for a couple of months, but I was terrified of the D word. Well, one of the guys slipped me a business card for a D-man and it said, "We cater to cowards." That line might have not worked on anybody else, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. It turned out saying the word dentist, booking an appointment with a dentist, and working on my problem with my dentist set me free from the pain and agony I was experiencing. So it is with the word sin. The more you acknowledge it, the more you know about it, the more you understand what it is and how it works, the more pain and agony free you'll be. Okay, observation number 1. It all started with a lie. And at the nucleus of every sin is a lie. God wants me to be happy. And if I'm with that person who isn't my spouse, that will make me happy. Lie on so many counts. It's not hurting anyone else. It's my choice. What I do with my body. Lie. I can gossip about him because what he's doing is worse than my little gossip. Lie. I can take these supplies because the company can afford it. And besides, they don't pay me enough. Lie. In fact, deconstruct every sin and you'll find at its nucleus, it is nothing but another lie. Number 2, sin causes self-sovereignty to live in all of us. Sin doesn't primarily make us disobedient. Sin makes us distrustful of God, which leads to disobedience. Wrapped around the nucleus of every sin is an attitude of self-sovereignty and a blatant declaration that we will do it our way rather than God's way. And observation number 3, sin is not about breaking rules. It's about breaking relationship. The Old Testament prophet Isaiah put it this way in Isaiah 59:2. It's your sin that cuts you off from God. Because of your sins, he has turned away and will not listen anymore. Sin isn't about breaking some obscure or abstract rule from the rule book. Sin is about splintering our relationship with God. When we sin, we're not just choosing to color outside the lines or drive through the guardrails that God has established. We're choosing to worship and treasure something more than we do God. Pastor John Piper explains this so well when he says, sin is the glory of God not honored, the holiness of God not reverenced, the greatness of God not admired, the power of God not praised, the truth of God not sought, the wisdom of God not esteemed, the beauty of God not treasured, the goodness of God not savored, the faithfulness of God not trusted, the promises of God not believed, the commands of God not obeyed, the justice of God not respected, the wrath of God not feared, the grace of God not cherished, the presence of God not prized, the person of God not loved. Sin isn't about rules. It's about relationship. And observation number 4, sin writes us out of God's will. In the New Testament, the original ancient Greek word for sin is hamartia. It has a few literal meanings. For instance, it means to miss the mark. This is where we often give the illustration of an archer aiming for the target, God's bullseye, but he misses the mark. He hamartias or sins. Another literal meaning is to wander from the path. This is the hiker who is safely trying to hike through a valley and over a mountain pass, but wanders from the clearly marked trail and ends up lost and alone, and if not found, dead. However, I never noticed a third literal meaning until this last week, and it's this: to be without a share in. To be without a share in. That one had me scratching my head a bit. So I read a few stories of children of billionaires who did some stuff and got themselves written out of the will. They now were in a state of being without a share in the estate and fortune. And I thought, how absolutely terrible. To be in line for a $5 billion inheritance, only to have been written out of the will and now have zero claim to share in the fortune. Do you know what that sounds like to me? Sin. Because that's what sin does. It writes us out of the will of God. When we are in a state of sin, we are without a share in the fortunes and the estate of heaven. When we are choosing to worship and treasure something more than we do God, we are without a share in God's kingdom and promises. But this is where we truly begin to appreciate the lost or stolen treasure and the word sin. Listen to this. But God demonstrated his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. For God presented Jesus as a sacrifice for sin. People are made right with God when they believe that Jesus sacrificed his life, shedding his blood. So you also should consider yourselves to be dead to the power of sin and alive to God through Christ Jesus. What does that mean? It means that the problem of sin that started with a lie and tries to lie to us every day, that causes self-sovereignty to live in all of us, enticing us to trust and love ourselves more than God, that splinters and breaks our relationship with God, and that writes us out of his opulent inheritance, was reversed by Christ on the cross. The lie is exposed and broken. Our eyes are open to treasure God above all else. Our relationship with God is mended and restored, God the Father literally adopting us into his heavenly family. And our names are signed with the indelible ink of Jesus' blood onto the document that transfers all of Christ's inheritance to us. And this is why I want to steal the word sin back and hold on to this lost treasure that our world has disregarded. Because although it's not a pretty word, and it can cause some stress, it's better to know about it than not. If I was in a canoe bobbing down a river, I'd want to know that there was a problem around the next corner in the shape of a 100-meter waterfall with rocks at the bottom before I got there. If I was in an airplane, as difficult as it would be to take, I would want to know that we had a problem and were running out of fuel before the engines stopped and we were nosediving. If I was in a sailboat, as stressful and challenging as it would be, I would want to know that we had a problem called Hurricane Ian long before it was bearing down on us in the middle of the ocean. If I was a hiker, as nerve-wracking as it would be, I would want to know that we had a problem and that a thunderstorm was coming to flood the narrow valley that I was in long before the water began rising. And as a sojourner on this planet, as hard as it is to face sometimes, I would much rather know that there is a problem called sin that will kill me, but can be escaped before it's my time to stand before my Creator and give an account. And that's what every chapter in the Bible after Genesis chapter 3 is trying to tell us. And it's never explained more clearly than in Paul's letter to the Romans. Church, I think it's time we stole the word sin back and paid more attention to what God has to say about it.